Okay, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the learning perspective in personality. Uh, Specifically today we're going to focus on classical conditioning. But in general, the learning perspective implies that personality essentially comes from our learned experiences. The experiences that we have essentially change the way we behave. We turn, like for example, when it comes to classical conditioning, we tend to, there are certain things that we react to that we like, and there are certain things that we react to that we dislike, and a lot of that can become from stuff that we've learned through classical conditioning. When it comes to operant or instrumental conditioning, there are circumstances where we will engage in behaviors to get some kind of positive consequence, like a reward afterwards. And so we'll engage in various behaviors, be the type of people that we want to be, essentially, and we get rewarded for that, so we continue to do that. So essentially, the learning perspective really focuses on our behaviors, but our personality, much of what our personality is the sum total of our behaviors. So, learning essentially very clearly describes behavior patterns. And behavior patterns you can look at as an important part of what personality actually is. So the learning perspective does play a big role. Okay? Again, with classical conditioning, you essentially learn to make an association between one stimulus and another. So, like a little child can associate a doctor's office with the shot that they get at the doctor's office. The shot is painful and would naturally cause pain and fear. With classical conditioning, what happens is after the child goes to the doctor, then gets the shot, now the child gets that fear response directly from the doctor's office. So actually the doctor's office becomes what is called a conditioned stimulus that leads to a conditioned response of fear. Fear in response to the doctor's office. It is a learned response because the child was not naturally afraid of a doctor's office. Only when this doctor's office became paired with the shot, that's when the child became afraid of it. When it comes to operant or instrumental conditioning, people learn to essentially, after engaging in a particular behavior, some kind of a consequence follows. So if swimming fast leads to the consequence of getting a medal, then you're going to repeat that behavior. You're going to work harder, you're going to swim faster, you're going to keep on doing those things that get you those rewards. And there are many examples of that as well. So in other words, if you looked at that, for example, you might say someone who is a motivated athlete really is someone who gets rewarded for their athletic behavior, and essentially you can explain that motivation essentially through operant conditioning. So again, it gives you an idea of how different types of learning can essentially lead to personality, aspects of our personality. So let's start with classical conditioning. Starts with Pavlov's classic study, where he essentially was measuring the salivation of dogs. He was actually a physiologist. He was not a psychologist. And he hooked up dogs to a device that measured the amount of saliva that the dog produced. He gives the dog food, and the dog salivates in response to the food. That's what dogs will naturally do. What he discovered in the course of his research was that the dog was salivating before the food got there. Now, why was the dog salivating before the food got there? Well, then if you own a dog, you know that when you start getting the food ready, the dog is starting to get ready to eat. And the dog is drooling, and the dog is ready for you. So the dog in Pavlov's study was essentially ready for the food and was salivating before the food got there. And that's where he began to try to measure this out in some kind of a predictable way to establish and study this learning phenomenon, which essentially we call classical conditioning. And essentially what happened was what Pavlov did was that he set it up a circumstance where he would ring a bell before presenting the food, and essentially pairing those two stimuli, such that eventually the dog learned to salivate in response to the bell. And that was essentially what he discovered. So to break it down here, the normal response that a dog would have would be the unconditioned stimulus would be food, and the unconditioned response would be salivation in response to food. This would be an existing reflex. So basically, with classical conditioning, we'll start with some natural process that we have. Some natural physiological process that we have. Once you pair another stimulus with the stimulus that naturally causes our response, eventually what will happen is, this is still leading to the unconditioned response, salivation, for Pavlov, salivation in response to food. What eventually happens is now, with repeated pairings, the conditioned stimulus leads to the conditioned response, until finally now, after conditioning is complete, you don't even need the unconditioned stimulus anymore. The conditioned stimulus by itself leads to conditioned response. So here's how it would come out procedure-wise. Before conditioning, that leads to no response in the dog. Food, however, would naturally lead to a response. So the salivation in response to the food is the unconditioned stimulus. During conditioning, the bell is paired with the food. Conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired. Salivation is still in response to the food. Once that pairing is done repeatedly, eventually what happens is that the bell, by itself, will produce the desired conditioned response of salivation. So this is what he discovered. With repeated pairings of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually the conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response. Well, that's all well and good, but what does that have to do with human beings, and what does it have to do with personality? Well, it turns out we have a lot of things that naturally cause us to have physiological responses. We learn that we have physiological responses to tasty food, for example. Okay? It is natural and normal for us to enjoy tasty food. Well, if we pair something with that tasty food, eventually it's that thing that gets paired with the tasty food that we tend to associate with the food and we tend to like. They discuss in the textbook an example of this would be like a business lunch. Okay? You want to impress your clients, so you bring them to a nice restaurant here, and they have your smiling face, and you're showing your proposal for that you want to do business with them, and in the meantime you're eating this delicious food. Well, your customer is going to pair that smiling face and your proposal with the tasty food, and just like he likes the tasty food, he's going to end up liking your proposal and liking your smiling face. So bottom line, we find different things that we come across in our life that we associate with pleasure, and those are the things we like. The things that we associate with pain and displeasure, those are things we don't like. And so it's like things that we, for example, let's say you meet a person with red hair, and immediately after that, the person with red hair starts beating you up. So you're beaten up by someone with red hair. Well, you might decide that you don't like people with red hair because you associate anyone with red hair with that first person who beat you up. And this would be an example of classical conditioning. You just have an automatic association of dislike just from someone with red hair. And there are just many different examples you could think of that would reflect this, that could come out in the complex picture of our personality. So I want you to do a practice activity here on the PowerPoint. I have here these two scenarios here. And I want you to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Let's start with Jonathan. Jonathan loves spicy food. Last week he ate at Tia Mexicana 3 times and literally perspired from the hot spices. Yesterday, as he drove past the restaurant, Jonathan began to perspire profusely. Okay, what's happening here? What is the unconditioned stimulus? Now you remember the unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that would naturally cause a physiological response. So what in this scenario, what stimulus in this scenario will naturally cause a physiological response? Well, that stimulus is the spicy food. Spicy food naturally makes a human being sweat because it stimulates those pain receptors, that hot sensation, and you sweat. I know I sweat when I eat spicy food. Okay? So therefore, we know what the unconditioned stimulus is. Therefore, you know what the unconditioned response is. If it's the spicy food that's the stimulus, in response to the spicy food, that is the unconditioned response. Now remember, sweating in response to spicy food does not involve learning. This is an automatic activity, an automatic reaction that we have to that stimulus. It's biologically programmed in us. So there's no learning yet. But then, what is the conditioned stimulus? A stimulus that causes a learned response. Well, he passed by the restaurant. The restaurant becomes that conditioned stimulus. Passing by the restaurant after he's already eaten there. Now, after passing the restaurant, he starts sweating. Well, that sweating is not in response to the food anymore. Now it's in response to the restaurant. Jonathan has learned to have that sweating response in response to the restaurant. And I'll let you figure out Jeremiah's case on your own. Okay, let's start with an important process in kind of the first step, which is acquisition. The root word for acquisition is to acquire. This is where you are acquiring, where you are making that initial connection between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. This is where you're first making that click, making that connection. So if we're talking about Pavlov and his dogs, it's when the dog makes the connection between the bell and then the food that follows. The more often you make those pairings, so if you think bell and the food, bell and the food, bell and the food, bell and the food, repeated pairings, what's going to happen is the dog will make that association. Well, this will happen with you as well. The more often you pair the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the more likely the conditioning, the learning will take place. Okay? If the unconditioned stimulus is a really strong one, it's going to take place rapidly. An example of this might be where you eat something and you get really, really sick after you eat it. That unconditioned stimulus, whatever it is that caused you that sickness, now that is going to lead you to have a very strong reaction to whatever it was you ate before you got sick. So you might develop a conditioned taste aversion to hot dogs. Let's say if after eating a hot dog you got really, really sick. Okay. Basically, in order for the best way in which the acquisition is going to occur is if you present the conditioned stimulus right before the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus presumably should essentially make the respondent anticipate that here comes the unconditioned stimulus. So maybe with the dog, for example, the bell signals, here comes the food, and the dog starts salivating. And that represents something cognitive, and maybe the dog is actually thinking about it in some way. With a bell leads the dog to think, here comes the food. And this is kind of a debate in the behavioral perspective as far as whether or not there's any cognition involved. Skinner didn't really care about any cognition that went along with it. He just said, hey, these are the stimuli, and this is and pairing the stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus leads to a stronger response, and that's essentially what they cared about. Is in other words, it's not about consciously thinking about it. It just kind of automatically happens. So anyway, that's a debate in the literature. Okay, so acquiring the classically conditioned response is one thing, but then you need to this classically conditioned response is not necessarily going to last forever. You might have the phenomenon called extinction, is where that conditioned response that you've learned eventually disappears. Here's an example. Let's say you've got a boyfriend, and your boyfriend wears a particular scent of cologne. Okay? When you're with your boyfriend, you smell your boyfriend's cologne, and being with your boyfriend is naturally pleasurable. Okay? He's the person you love, and he naturally gives you pleasure. But the smell of the cologne essentially precedes the presence of your boyfriend. So you learn to associate the conditioned stimulus, being the cologne, with the unconditioned stimulus of your boyfriend. Alright? Eventually what happens is, over repeated times that your boyfriend wearing the cologne, you see your boyfriend, smell the cologne, every time the cologne, boyfriend, eventually just the smell of the cologne by itself, with or without your boyfriend, is going to cause a physiological reaction. You are going to start feeling more physiologically aroused, perhaps more sexually aroused. You might be walking in the shopping mall and be passing by a store that sells colognes, and you might smell your boyfriend's cologne coming out of the store. And what might happen is, just by passing by the store, you might start having that feeling of arousal, because you're associating the smell of the cologne with your boyfriend. Okay? And that may mean, like, for the rest of your life, you might like that smell. Even if, but now let's see what happens if you break up with your boyfriend, or your boyfriend, let's say, says, okay, boyfriend has a job on an oil rig, and he's going to be away on the oil rig for 3 months. Okay? So here it is, your boyfriend is going out to sea for 3 months. No boyfriend. But you still have his cologne. You may even have some of his shirts in your apartment, and it might smell, right? So you might smell the cologne from your boyfriend, but then again, no boyfriend. First time you smell after he's gone, you are going to feel your arousal, but maybe you'll feel arousal a little bit less each and every time. Or maybe you're going to be passing by the mall and you'll smell the cologne at the shopping mall. It'll have an effect on you, but not so much. Eventually, gradually, your conditioned response, in this case arousal, is going to be weakened. Each time you present the cologne without the boyfriend, by presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, eventually you get less and less aroused. Your conditioned response becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and it gradually happens. Going back to Pavlov's case, the way he showed extinction was by ringing the bell and did not present the food. Ring the bell, no food. Ring the bell, no food. Ring the bell, no food. Eventually, the dog stopped salivating because the dog essentially figured out, oh, no food is coming. Bells rings, no food. So here's what extinction looks like. It's a gradual process when the conditioned stimulus is presented without the unconditioned stimulus, until eventually no more response. So you might pass that mall every day during the week, passing by that store, smelling your boyfriend's cologne, and eventually, since you know your boyfriend isn't going to be there that night, you're going to feel less and less aroused each time you smell it. Eventually, your response to the cologne will be extinguished. You will no longer have the conditioned response. But it is possible that that response, that classically conditioned response, is not completely gone after all. Because it turns out that we have the ability to relearn that connection, to reacquire that connection, I should say, and to do it very quickly, much more quickly than before. And that indicates the concept of spontaneous recovery. If there is a time delay, and you, again, do not have any further contact with the unconditioned stimulus, then after that time delay, that classically conditioned response can back up again. So, for example, with Pavlov's case, when he rang the bell the next day, after the response was extinguished, the dog started salivating again, right away. Maybe it didn't salivate quite as much, but it salivated again right away. It hadn't completely lost that connection between the bell and the food. Let's go back to your boyfriend. Let's say for 3 months now your boyfriend is gone, and who knows, maybe now he makes a surprise visit for you. He's wearing that cologne. That boyfriend comes through the door, you smell that cologne, you are instantly going to be super aroused, and you're going to be aroused by that smell of that cologne. Your response is going to come back, and you might even get that arousal again when you pass by the store at the mall. So here's how it looks. Here's the extinction phase. After that pause, the spontaneous recovery instantly happens. It's a less intense response, but it's a response nonetheless. But it's a conditioned response that has spontaneously recurred. Okay? So the bottom line is, so these are important processes here. You acquire the connection between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned response becomes extinguished if the conditioned stimulus is presented over and over again without the unconditioned stimulus. And with spontaneous recovery, after a pause, once a classically conditioned response is extinguished, it can start again right away, because you don't have to as quickly anymore. You seem to have already got it somewhere within you. Now here is where we can even expand further and really see how specific personality can develop. Okay? With classical conditioning. And generalization is an important way in which you can look at this. With generalization, you can be presented with a new stimulus, one that is similar to the original one, and that would elicit the conditioned response. What if there was some kind of a knockoff version of your boyfriend's cologne? It smells slightly different than what your boyfriend wears. But it is possible you might generalize. You might have that physiological arousal to the smell of the knockoff cologne. Therefore, what happens is this is an example of generalization. The stimulus, a different stimulus, is creating the same kind of reaction. You are making that association with a new stimulus, one that is similar to the conditioned stimulus, and they're being able to associate it with the unconditioned stimulus. So this can be a very interesting application to personality, for example. Let's say you as a child had a positive experience with another child. You and another child played, you had fun, and the presence of this child makes you happy, makes you smile. Well, what if you find that other children who look similar to this friend, you tend to start automatically liking? You don't know them necessarily, but for some reason you like him. If the boy you played with had blonde hair and blue eyes, then now you tend to like everyone who has blonde hair and blue eyes. Just like the red-headed person who beat you up, now anyone with red hair automatically dislike. You may not even necessarily know why, but you're generalizing from the red-headed kid who beat you up to all red-headed people. And that's essentially where generalization can occur. And again, realize that generalization kind of, indicates like a broad range of likes and dislikes that a person has. That sounds a lot like personality. With discrimination, this is where you make distinctions between some things and others. You might learn to say that you like this, but you don't like that. Okay? So maybe you've discovered, for example, you like playing with the boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, but realizing that maybe it only applies to blue-eyed, blonde-haired boys and not blue-eyed, blonde-haired girls. Maybe you can distinguish between those two, and essentially you have a positive reaction to the blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys, but maybe no reaction, or perhaps even a negative reaction, to blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls. That would be discrimination. Now, mind you, I say discrimination sounds like a bad word. We know what discrimination means. Essentially, we are going to be treating one group differently than another. And that is certainly one definition of discrimination. But that's, and in some way that makes sense in this definition here. With discrimination, you are distinguishing one stimulus from another. One stimulus gets paired with the unconditioned stimulus, one stimulus doesn't. One stimulus is associated with the things you like, and the other one is not. And if you can distinguish one from the other, that indicates some specific likes and dislikes that you might have, rather than just like general ones. And you'll realize again that the correct stimulus, the one that is followed by that's followed by the unconditioned stimulus, that's the one that you learn to react to. The other one you don't react to. Oftentimes we have to distinguish between certain things. Maybe there's like fast food that you like, right? Maybe you like Raising Cane's, but you really do not like Jack in the Box. So if you pass by a Raising Cane's sign, your mouth is going to water. You pass by a Jack in the Box sign, and you're going to have no reaction, or maybe your mouth won't, or maybe you'll start feeling yuck. So in that case, you are using discrimination here. You are reacting differently to the Raising Cane sign, which makes your mouth water, and the Jack in the Box sign, which doesn't. Okay, and this is just an illustration of work that's done with dogs, where the different sounding bell, if the different sounding bell doesn't lead to food, the dog will learn to salivate to the bell that leads to the food and ignore the bell that doesn't. Okay, higher order conditioning is a further extension of the learned association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Once you have established your conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus, that conditioned response actually kind of becomes automatic. Remember with Pavlov and his dogs, the dog would learn to salivate in response to the bell. Now, salivation in response to a bell is not a normal reaction that dogs have. It is something that the dog learned to do in Pavlov's laboratory. But the But once the dog learns to salivate in response to the bell, now the dog's response is automatic. The salivation is not chosen. The dog can choose it to salivate. The dog is automatically salivating in response to that bell. So what does this mean? Once you've made that clear-cut establishment, conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, now you can associate something else with that conditioned stimulus. Let's go back in time to Pavlov's study. What would happen if, again, ring the bell, then present the food, dog salivates. Ring the bell, then the food, dog salivates. What would happen if now the door of the laboratory opens and in comes the research assistant who sets up the bell and then sets up the food? What might happen is the dog might salivate in response to the researcher coming into the lab. It's a higher order conditioning. It's like one step beyond the conditioned stimulus. Now it's a second conditioned stimulus, or it could be a third one, or it could be a fourth one. I had a student who, when we talked about this in class once, had said that she drove her child to the doctor. And remember how I said in the beginning there, if you go back here to the first example here, the classical conditioning example where the conditioned stimulus of a doctor's office leads to, associated with the unconditioned stimulus of a shot, leads to a conditioned response of fear in response to the doctor's office. Well, how can higher order conditioning here happen? Well, what if the child associates the doctor's building and starts getting afraid when the doctor approaches the building, or approaches the parking lot of the building? If the child starts showing fear, it's like one step beyond. Now let's go back to the concept of higher order conditioning here. Go back to my student who had said that she drove her child to the doctor, and her child started getting nervous and started complaining when she got off of the highway at the exit ramp to go to where the doctor's office is. So in this case, the child developed a higher order conditioning. The child discovered essentially that it was the highway that leads to the exit, that leads to the street, that leads to the parking lot, that leads to the doctor's office, that leads to the shot. And just getting off the exit was enough to signal to that girl, I don't want to go to the doctor. It starts signaling that fear. And again, you can think of how many different fears might develop in human beings. In fact, let me kind of skip down a little bit to the end here. Talk a little bit about phobias, because phobias are examples of a condition that is often usually believed to have started from classical conditioning. Okay? Basically, a phobia is an irrational fear of a particular of something that maybe wouldn't necessarily naturally cause you fear. Maybe you have an intense fear of clowns. Actually, that's a fairly common phobia, to be afraid of clowns. Well, how does somebody have an intense, irrational fear of clowns? Well, maybe one bad experience with a clown. Maybe some birthday clown scared the pants off of you. Now, as an adult, seeing a picture of a clown even starts getting you feeling fear. You know it doesn't make any sense. You know it's illogical and irrational. But that fear in the pit of your stomach, when you see a picture of a clown, and that intense fear when you actually even see a person dressed up as a clown, boy, you can't go to the circus. So how do you treat the phobia? Well, essentially what you want to do is you want to extinguish the phobia. The way to extinguish the phobia is you've got to get in contact with that thing that causes you fear. It's not easy to do, but that's the only way to do it. You have to get in contact with the thing that is causing you fear. Let's say, in this case, say the clown. You need to perhaps go to see clown show, go to see clown presentations, and go to see it over and over again. Each time you go see it, nothing terrible happens. Your fear gets diminished. So eventually, it can become extinguished. You want to extinguish the classically conditioned response of fear to the conditioned stimulus of a clown. A more formalized procedure is called systematic desensitization, in which the client who has a phobia, and the phobia may be interfering with that person's life. Maybe it's a phobia of heights, let's say. Okay? And maybe the phobia, he can't go to people's houses if it has a second floor. He can't go to a conference hotel because he's afraid of going up past the second floor. He's got to essentially practice these kind of activities, but also pair it with relaxation. But you want to start small. So maybe have him think about a tall building and at the same time have him breathe deeply and relax. Then maybe after that, you show him a picture of a tall building. Again, he's going to feel nervous, but you're going to let him breathe and relax. So he's pairing the relaxation with the stimulus that scares him, and eventually the client will become relaxed in response to these things that caused fear before. But again, you got to kind of take a gradual approach, a hierarchy, so to speak, of where you want to get like from low-level anxiety to higher-level anxiety. At the last step of systematic desensitization, the therapist might take the client to the top of the Empire State Building and go to the observation deck and walk around it and look down. And eventually, maybe after that point, the fear of heights is gone. Well, let's go back to now one more aspect of classical conditioning called emotional conditioning. Classical conditioning response is a physiological response. The physiological response can be an emotional reaction. So, in other words, if the emotional reaction is positive, it's something we like. If it's emotional reaction is negative, it's something we dislike. If we come in contact with things that we initially don't like, it's going to be harder for that person to learn to like that person, because from once that first dislike comes around, now the person is actually going to try to avoid coming into contact with people like that. So in other words, the likes and dislikes come about through classical conditioning. So in other words, if we look at our human personality from the point of view of classical conditioning, we could say that we learn to have automatic physiological reactions to things. And these automatic physiological reactions essentially become part of our personality. Where we learn, for example, maybe one person learns because of a classically conditioned response that maybe learns that he doesn't like ranch houses because maybe he lived in a ranch house and had all these bad experiences living there, and now every time he sees a ranch house, he just doesn't like it. I don't like it. And that's just one aspect of his personality, because of the pairing of a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus repeatedly over and over again. You learn to develop that classically conditioned response. Okay, next time we are going to get started on instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning, to give you an idea of how we learn in terms of how we actually take steps of our own to try to get some kind of positive consequence to our behavior.